Welcome to Betrayed Hearts Chronicles. The summer evening air was thick with the hum of conversation and the sizzle of meat on the grill. Jessica adjusted the strap of her sundress, feeling a mixture of pride and exhaustion at pulling off another perfect barbecue. Their backyard, a cozy sanctuary with strings of twinkling lights and the soft rustle of the oak tree overhead, had become a staple gathering place for friends and family. Tonight, though, felt different. "Jess, where's the beer?" her husband, Mark, called from the grill, his voice carrying over the chatter of their guests. "In the cooler, same as always," she shouted back, balancing a tray of fruit skewers. The laughter of a nearby group of friends caught her attention, and she turned to see Ryan, Mark's best friend, commanding the small circle. She hadn't seen Ryan in months, and he looked different. More polished, she thought, though still retaining the boyish charm she remembered from when they'd first met years ago at her wedding. "Jessica," Ryan said, breaking away from his group as she approached. His smile was easy, his tone warm. "It's been forever. You look amazing." She felt a flush of warmth at the compliment. "Ryan, it has been a while. How's everything?" They launched into casual conversation, catching up on work and life. Ryan spoke about his recent hiking trip in Colorado, his animated descriptions drawing her in. Jessica found herself laughing more than she had in weeks. His humor was effortless, his charisma magnetic. "I didn't know you were into hiking," Jessica said, surprised. "Are you kidding? It's my escape." "Mark never mentioned it," Ryan asked, his tone light but his gaze sharp, as if gauging her reaction. "No," she said with a soft laugh. "Mark isn't exactly the outdoorsy type these days. We haven't done anything like that since, well, probably before we got married." Ryan tilted his head. "That's a shame. You'd love the trails out west. Maybe one day I'll convince both of you to come along." "Or just me," she quipped without thinking. The words hung in the air, and she quickly added, "I mean, if Mark's too busy or something." Ryan's smile didn't waver, but his eyes seemed to glint with a deeper understanding. "I'll hold you to that." Their conversation stretched on, their laughter and shared interests creating a bubble that felt oddly intimate in the crowded backyard. Mark eventually joined them, clapping Ryan on the back and teasing him about his grilling skills. But Jessica couldn't help noticing how often Ryan's eyes flicked back to hers, as if the conversation they'd started wasn't quite finished. Later that evening, after the guests had left and the house was quiet, Jessica replayed the moments with Ryan in her mind. The way he had listened, how easily the words had flowed between them, and the faint thrill she felt every time he smiled. Mark was already snoring beside her, oblivious to the thoughts swirling in her head. She stared at the ceiling, wondering why her heart had raced so much around Ryan. "It's just the wine," she whispered to herself, closing her eyes. But deep down, she wasn't so sure. The sound of the doorbell startled Jessica from her afternoon routine. She had been folding laundry in the living room, the steady hum of a true crime podcast playing in the background. Glancing at the clock, she frowned. It was mid-afternoon, and she wasn't expecting anyone. Peeking through the window, she saw Ryan standing on the porch, holding a small brown bag in one hand and his phone in the other. He looked relaxed, his usual confident stance slightly softened by the casual jeans and a t-shirt he wore. Jessica opened the door, smiling despite herself. "Ryan, this is unexpected." "Hey Jess," he said, his voice warm. "Mark asked me to drop this off. Something about tools he borrowed last week." He held up the bag. She waved him inside. "Come on in. He's at work, but I can take it." As Ryan stepped inside, Jessica was suddenly aware of how quiet the house was. She gestured toward the kitchen, where the counters were still littered with remnants of her morning coffee and a half-read book. "Sorry about the mess," she said, clearing a space on the counter for the bag. Ryan leaned against the island, arms crossed, giving her a lopsided grin. "This is what you call messy? You should see my place. Looks like a hurricane hit it." Jessica chuckled, feeling the tension she hadn't realized was building in her chest begin to ease. "I'm sure it's not that bad. But if you're admitting defeat, I'm guessing you didn't find anyone to settle you down yet. He raised an eyebrow. Straight to the heart of it, huh? His tone was teasing, but there was a flicker of something more serious in his expression. Nah, not yet. Guess I'm too set in my ways for the whole white picket fence life. Mark and I used to dream about that, Jessica said softly, surprised by her own candor. The perfect house, the perfect life. It's funny how things turn out, though. Ryan studied her for a moment, his gaze steady. Funny how? Jessica hesitated, feeling as if she had revealed too much. Oh, you know, she said quickly, forcing a smile. It's never quite as perfect as you picture it. Ryan's eyes didn't leave hers, and for a moment, the air between them felt heavy, charged. He broke the silence first, his tone lightening. Well, if you ever need someone to complain to, you know where to find me. I'm a great listener. Jessica laughed, though her heart thudded in her chest. I'll keep that in mind. She offered him a cup of coffee, and before long, they were sitting at the small table by the window, talking like old friends. Their conversation drifted from lighthearted topics, favorite movies, the best hiking trails in the area, to more personal ground. I remember Mark talking about how you used to paint, Ryan said, tilting his head slightly. Do you still do that? Jessica felt a pang at the question. Not really. Life gets busy, you know, between work and everything else. Shame, Ryan said, his voice low but sincere. I bet you were amazing at it. The warmth in his words made her stomach flip. She looked down at her mug, tracing the rim with her finger. Thanks, she murmured. The conversation paused, but the silence wasn't uncomfortable. Instead, it hummed with unspoken thoughts and a subtle, growing tension. Eventually, Ryan glanced at the time and stood, stretching. I should get going. Don't want to overstay my welcome. Jessica followed him to the door, her pulse quickening as he turned to face her one last time. Thanks for the coffee, he said, his tone softer than before. Anytime, she replied, her voice quieter than she intended. As Ryan stepped outside, he hesitated for a moment, looking back at her. Their eyes met, and the connection was undeniable, electric in its intensity. Then he smiled, a small, knowing smile, and walked away. Jessica shut the door, leaning against it as she tried to steady her breathing. She felt exposed, as though Ryan had seen something inside her that even she had been trying to ignore. Her phone buzzed on the counter, breaking the spell. It was a text from Mark. Late meeting. Don't wait up for dinner. Jessica sighed, setting the phone down. She didn't understand what was happening, but the way her heart reacted to Ryan's presence left her feeling both exhilarated and terrified. The weekend had brought a reprieve from the monotony of the week, and Mark had proposed a group hiking trip. It was an unusual suggestion for her husband, who was more of a spectator than a participant when it came to the outdoors. But he'd insisted that it would be fun to get everyone together. Jessica had agreed reluctantly, but as the crisp morning air kissed her cheeks and the scent of pine filled her lungs, she was glad they'd come. A small group had gathered: Mark, Ryan, and a couple of mutual friends. The trail wound through a dense forest, with sunlight filtering through the canopy and birds chirping in the distance. As they climbed, Mark lagged behind, engrossed in a conversation with their friend Paul. Jessica found herself walking ahead with Ryan, their strides naturally sinking. You're keeping up better than I expected, Ryan teased, glancing at her with a grin. Jessica rolled her eyes playfully. What's that supposed to mean? I'll have you know I used to do this all the time. Used to, Ryan echoed. Key words there. But I stand corrected. You're making this look easy. She laughed, the sound light and unrestrained, surprising even herself. She hadn't felt this carefree in ages. They continued to banter as the trail grew steeper, their conversation pausing only when Jessica stumbled over a loose rock. Ryan's hand shot out instinctively, grabbing her waist to steady her. You okay? He asked, his hand still firmly on her side. Jessica nodded, her breath catching as she looked up at him. Their faces were inches apart, and for a moment, the world seemed to fall away. The feel of his hand against her skin, even through the fabric of her jacket, sent a jolt of electricity through her. "Thanks," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Ryan's eyes lingered on hers before he pulled his hand away, the moment stretching longer than it should have. "Careful," he said softly. She swallowed hard, nodding again as she forced herself to focus on the trail ahead. The group continued their ascent, but Jessica couldn't shake the memory of his touch. It was as though her body had come alive in a way it hadn't in years. At the summit, they stopped to rest and take in the breathtaking view of the valley below. Mark handed Jessica a bottle of water, oblivious to the tension that had built between her and Ryan. She avoided meeting Ryan's gaze, afraid of what she might see there, or what he might see in hers. As they began the descent, the trail narrowed, forcing them to walk single file. Jessica found herself behind Ryan, the steady rhythm of his movements oddly mesmerizing. She tried to push the thoughts from her mind, focusing instead on the crunch of leaves beneath her boots and the cool breeze brushing her face. But when they reached a tricky section of the trail, Ryan paused and turned back to her. "Here," he said, extending a hand. Jessica hesitated for a split second before taking it. His grip was firm, reassuring, and yet the simple gesture felt charged with meaning. As he helped her over the uneven ground, their hands lingered just a moment too long before letting go. By the time they reached the base of the trail, Jessica's emotions were in turmoil. The hike had been invigorating, but the tension with Ryan had left her feeling off balance. She found herself hyper-aware of every glance, every word exchanged between them. Back at the parking lot, as everyone packed up their gear, Mark clapped Ryan on the back. "Thanks for coming, man. Jess and I were just saying how good it was to get out and do something like this." Ryan nodded, his eyes briefly meeting Jessica's before shifting away. "Yeah, it was great. Let's do it again sometime." As they drove home, Mark chattered about the hike, oblivious to Jessica's silence. Her mind was elsewhere, replaying the moments with Ryan. The feel of his hand, the way his eyes had lingered on hers. She stared out the window, her heart heavy with confusion. She knew she was treading dangerous ground, but part of her wasn't sure she wanted to stop. The invitation was innocent enough on the surface. Ryan had texted Jessica the week after the hike, suggesting they check out an author talk at a nearby bookstore. He'd remembered her mentioning how much she loved the writer's work, a detail that struck her as thoughtful in a way she wasn't used to anymore. When she'd mentioned it to Mark, he'd waved it off. "You should go," he'd said, barely looking up from his phone. "I've got the game with Paul that night anyway." Jessica had hesitated before replying to Ryan, her fingers trembling slightly as she typed, "Sounds great. What time?" The evening came, and Jessica found herself standing in front of her closet, overthinking every choice. She finally settled on a simple wrap dress that felt casual but still flattering. When Ryan arrived, dressed in a button-up shirt and dark jeans, his appreciative glance as she opened the door made her pulse quicken. "Ready?" he asked, his voice warm and easy. Jessica nodded, her heart thudding in her chest as she stepped outside. The drive to the bookstore was filled with light conversation, Ryan teasing her about her excitement for the event. "You're like a kid on Christmas morning," he said with a laugh. "Well, I don't get out much," she admitted, smiling despite herself. The bookstore was packed, the air buzzing with anticipation. Ryan placed his hand lightly on her lower back as they navigated the crowd, the brief contact sending a shiver up her spine. They found seats near the middle, and as the author began speaking, Jessica felt herself relax, caught up in the discussion of stories and creativity. Afterward, they lingered as the crowd dispersed, chatting about the talk. "I didn't know you were such a fan of poetry," Jessica said, tilting her head as they strolled through the store. Ryan shrugged, a playful grin tugging at his lips. "I'm full of surprises." Jessica laughed, feeling lighter than she had in weeks. They wandered through the aisles, occasionally pulling books off the shelves to show each other. At one point, Ryan held up a novel with a dramatic, over-the-top cover. "This," he said, his voice mock serious, "is probably the greatest piece of literature ever written." Jessica giggled, shaking her head. "You're ridiculous." Their hands brushed as they reached for the same book, and they both froze for a moment, their laughter fading. Ryan's gaze met hers, and the air between them seemed to shift. "Jess," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. She looked away, her cheeks flushing. "We should probably go," she said, her voice unsteady. Ryan hesitated before nodding. "Yeah, let's get some air." Outside, the cool night breeze felt like a relief against Jessica's warm skin. They walked toward Ryan's car in silence, the tension between them palpable. As they reached the vehicle, Ryan leaned against the door, watching her closely. "You seemed like you had fun tonight," he said, his tone lighter. "I did," Jessica admitted. "It was nice to talk about something different for a change." Ryan's expression softened. "You deserve that. More than you probably let yourself believe." Jessica felt her throat tighten at his words. She wasn't sure if it was the sincerity in his tone or the way his eyes seemed to see straight through her defenses, but it left her feeling vulnerable. "Thank you," she said softly. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Ryan reached out, brushing a stray strand of hair from her face. The gesture was tender, and Jessica's breath caught. "Jess," he said again, his voice filled with something she couldn't quite name. "I should go," she said quickly, stepping back. Ryan straightened, his hand falling to his side. "Right, of course." The drive back was quiet, the air between them thick with unspoken words. When they reached her house, Ryan hesitated before speaking. "Thanks for tonight," he said. "It was good to see you like that, happy?" Jessica's chest ached at the honesty in his voice. "Thank you," she said again, her voice barely above a whisper. As she stepped out of the car, she felt his eyes on her, and for a moment, she wondered what it would feel like to stay. Inside, the house was dark and quiet. Mark was already asleep on the couch, the faint glow of the TV illuminating his face. Jessica stood there for a moment, watching him, her emotions in turmoil. She slipped upstairs, but as she lay in bed that night, all she could think about was Ryan. His touch, his voice, the way he had looked at her. The boundaries she had thought were so firm were beginning to blur, and she wasn't sure she had the strength to stop it. It started innocently enough. Ryan had offered to help Jessica with a home project, organizing the chaotic closet in the guest room. Mark had shrugged off the idea when Jessica brought it up, muttering something about not having time, but Ryan's casual, "I'll give you a hand," had felt like an unexpected lifeline. Jessica had agreed, partly to finish the project and partly because she wanted to see him again. It felt safe, two friends working together in a house she shared with her husband. What could possibly go wrong? When Ryan arrived, dressed in a fitted t-shirt and jeans that hugged him in all the right ways, Jessica found herself nervously brushing her hair from her face and adjusting her shirt. "Thanks for doing this," she said, her voice bright but slightly shaky. Ryan smiled, stepping inside. "No problem. Consider it my good deed for the week." They got to work, sorting through piles of forgotten clothes and boxes of old keepsakes. The mood was light at first, filled with laughter as they unearthed embarrassing items from the past. "Is this a photo album of Mark's high school band days?" Ryan said, holding up a dusty book. Jessica burst into laughter, taking the album from him. "Oh my God, yes. He swore he was going to be the next big rock star. Look at this hair." Ryan leaned in, their heads close as they flipped through the photos. The warmth of his proximity sent a shiver down her spine, and Jessica quickly pulled away, setting the album aside. As the afternoon wore on, the atmosphere shifted. The sun dipped lower, casting a golden light through the window. Their conversation grew quieter, more personal. Ryan asked about her life, her dreams, things she hadn't talked about in years. "Do you ever think about what you wanted to be?" he asked, sitting cross-legged on the floor beside her. Jessica hesitated, then nodded. "All the time. I wanted to be an artist. I had these big plans, but life gets in the way, you know?" Ryan's gaze was steady, his expression thoughtful. "You should still do it. You have this light in you, Jess. I see it every time you talk about the things you love." Her breath caught at his words, the sincerity in his voice cutting through her defenses. She looked away, her hands fumbling with a box of old books. I don't know, she murmured. Ryan reached over, his hand brushing hers. The touch was brief but enough to make her pulse quicken. She looked up and their eyes met. The air between them felt heavy, charged. Jess, he said softly, his voice a mix of hesitance and longing. Before she could think, before she could stop herself, she leaned in. Their lips met in a tentative kiss, soft and searching. The moment stretched, and then the tension snapped like a coiled spring. The kiss deepened, urgency replacing hesitation. Ryan's hands slid to her waist, pulling her closer as her fingers tangled in his hair. They moved as if in a dream, the world around them fading away. Wait, Jessica whispered, pulling back slightly. Her breathing was ragged, her heart pounding in her chest. This is wrong. Ryan rested his forehead against hers, his hands still on her waist. Tell me to stop and I will, he said, his voice low and earnest. Jessica hesitated, her mind screaming at her to end this, to walk away. But her body betrayed her, leaning into him, craving the warmth and connection she hadn't felt in years. I can't, she whispered, her voice breaking. Ryan kissed her again, and this time, there was no turning back. They moved to the guest room bed, their touches growing bolder, more desperate. Clothes were shed piece by piece, the barriers between them falling away as they explored each other with a hunger that had been building for weeks. Every touch, every kiss felt electric, igniting something in Jessica that she hadn't realized she'd lost. She felt alive, seen, desired in a way that left her breathless. Afterward, they lay tangled together, the room filled with the sound of their breathing. Reality began to seep back in, and Jessica felt a wave of guilt crash over her. She turned her face away, unable to meet Ryan's eyes. I should go, she said, sitting up and reaching for her clothes. Ryan propped himself on one elbow, watching her. Jess, wait. She shook her head, cutting him off. This was a mistake. Ryan sat up, his expression pained. It didn't feel like a mistake. Jessica couldn't answer. She dressed quickly and left the room, her heart pounding as she fled to the bathroom. Staring at her reflection in the mirror, she barely recognized the woman looking back at her. What have I done? She whispered, tears pricking her eyes. The house was silent as she emerged, Ryan already gone. But his presence lingered, his touch burned into her skin. And Jessica knew that things would never be the same. Jessica told herself it wouldn't happen again. She replayed that mantra in her head for days, clinging to the hope that she could lock the memory away and move forward. But the ache of Ryan's absence grew unbearable. It wasn't just the physical connection. It was how he had looked at her, listened to her, and made her feel seen. The texts began innocuously enough. Ryan sent her a photo of a book he thought she'd like, accompanied by a casual, "This reminded me of you." Jessica's response was hesitant but warm, thanking him and making a mental note to pick it up. A few days later, she found herself replying to another message. "Want to grab coffee and catch up?" Her fingers hovered over the keyboard for a moment before she typed back, "Okay." That coffee turned into lunch. Lunch turned into a drive to a secluded park where they walked along a quiet trail, their conversation drifting between safe topics and confessions that left them both breathless. "Do you think about it?" Jessica asked one afternoon, her voice barely audible over the rustling leaves. Ryan didn't pretend to misunderstand. "All the time," he admitted, his eyes locking onto hers. The tension between them crackled, and when he reached for her, she didn't resist. Their kiss was hungry, their touches frantic as they found shelter beneath a grove of trees. Their meetings became a regular part of Jessica's life. She told herself they were harmless at first, just moments to escape the monotony of her marriage. But each encounter blurred the lines further. Ryan rented a cabin an hour outside of town, tucked away from prying eyes. It became their haven, a place where they could shed the weight of their secrets and exist solely for each other. The first time Jessica stepped inside, the intimacy of the space took her breath away. It was small but warm, with soft lighting and a fireplace crackling in the corner. She glanced at Ryan, her heart pounding as he closed the door behind them. "This feels dangerous," she whispered. Ryan stepped closer, his hand brushing her cheek. "Only if we get caught." His words sent a thrill through her, and she pulled him into a kiss that quickly spiraled into more. The world outside ceased to matter as they explored each other's bodies, their passion growing bolder with each encounter. Jessica found herself craving these moments, counting down the days until she could be with him again. They spent hours tangled in each other, their conversations as intimate as their touches. Ryan listened in a way Mark never did, asking her about her hopes and fears, drawing out parts of her she had long buried. "Why do you stay with him?" Ryan asked one evening, as they lay entwined on the cabin's bed. Jessica hesitated, staring up at the ceiling. "Because it's easier," she admitted. "Because leaving would mean admitting that everything we built was a lie." Ryan traced circles on her bare shoulder. "You deserve more than easy." His words lingered in her mind long after she left the cabin. At home, Mark was oblivious to her absences, his focus on work or the TV. Jessica went through the motions, cooking dinner, making small talk, but her thoughts were always with Ryan. One afternoon, while folding laundry, her phone buzzed with a message from him. "Miss you." Jessica's heart skipped as she typed back, "Me too. When can I see you?" She knew she was walking a tightrope, but she couldn't stop. The thrill, the connection, the way Ryan made her feel alive. It was a drug she couldn't quit. But with every meeting, the risks grew. They were careful, always choosing secluded spots and making sure their stories lined up. Yet the fear of discovery loomed over them, a shadow that only added to the intensity of their affair. At night, lying next to Mark, Jessica felt the weight of her choices pressing down on her. She hated the lies, the deceit, but when she closed her eyes, all she could see was Ryan. His smile, his touch, the way he made her feel like the center of the universe. "I can't stop," she whispered to herself, the words both a confession and a resignation. She didn't know how this would end, but for now, she was willing to risk everything for the moments of joy she found in Ryan's arms. The affair had taken on a rhythm, a dangerous pulse that intertwined Jessica's life with Ryan's. Their meetings were frequent but carefully planned, their texts coded with innocent phrases that concealed their true intent. Yet, as their passion grew, so did the risks. Jessica sat at the kitchen table one afternoon, her phone lying face down next to her coffee. Her heart raced as she thought about the night before, when Ryan had whispered promises against her skin that made her want to throw caution to the wind. "Hey, what are you smiling about?" Mark's voice snapped her back to reality. Jessica's head shot up, her cheeks flushing. "Oh, nothing. Just thinking about a book I read." Mark frowned, grabbing a soda from the fridge. "You've been reading a lot lately. It's nice, I guess." He shrugged, already heading back to the living room. Jessica exhaled, her hands trembling. She was slipping. Later that evening, Ryan texted her, "Need to see you. Tonight." Jessica hesitated. Mark had a late meeting scheduled, but lately he'd started coming home earlier than expected. The thought of being caught sent a shiver down her spine, but the idea of saying no to Ryan was unbearable. "Come by after 8. He'll be out." When Ryan arrived, Jessica felt a mix of exhilaration and dread. She ushered him inside quickly, closing the door behind him. "We shouldn't do this here," she whispered, her voice taut with nerves. Ryan's hands slid around her waist, pulling her close. "I couldn't wait," he murmured, pressing a kiss to her neck. Jessica melted into his touch, her protests fading as they moved to the living room. They sank onto the couch, their kisses urgent, their hands roaming. Jessica tried to stay alert, her ears straining for any sound, but Ryan's touch consumed her, pulling her into a world where nothing else mattered. Then came the sound of a car pulling into the driveway. Jessica froze, her heart leaping into her throat. "Mark!" she hissed, scrambling to her feet. Ryan stood quickly, his expression shifting from passion to alarm. "What do we do?" Jessica shoved him toward the back door. "Go. I'll cover for you." Ryan hesitated for a fraction of a second before slipping out the door, his movements silent and swift. Jessica straightened her clothes, smoothing her hair just as the front door opened. Mark walked in, his eyes scanning the room. "Hey," he said, his tone casual but laced with curiosity. "Thought you said you'd be upstairs." "I was just getting some water," Jessica replied, her voice trembling slightly. She turned toward the kitchen, hoping the dim light would hide her flushed cheeks. Mark stared at her for a moment, then shrugged. "Okay." He tossed his keys on the counter and grabbed a beer. "Long day. I'm beat." Jessica nodded, her pulse pounding as she climbed the stairs to the bedroom. She closed the door behind her and leaned against it, her chest heaving. That night, as Mark slept soundly beside her, Jessica stared at the ceiling, replaying the close call. The fear of being discovered should have been enough to stop her, but instead, it only heightened the thrill. The next time she saw Ryan, they met at the cabin. Jessica's nerves were raw, the memory of Mark's unexpected arrival still fresh in her mind. "We have to be more careful," she said, pacing the small living room. Ryan stood by the window, watching her with a calm intensity. "I know," he said, "but I can't stay away from you, Jess." His words softened her resolve, and when he crossed the room to pull her into his arms, she didn't resist. The risks they were taking became harder to ignore. Jessica's friends began commenting on her frequent absences and the glow that seemed to follow her. Mark grew more observant, his questions about her whereabouts more frequent and pointed. One evening, Jessica returned home to find Mark sitting in the living room, her phone in his hand. "What's this?" he asked, holding up the screen. Jessica's blood ran cold. On the screen was a text from Ryan. "Miss you already." Her mind raced for an explanation. "It's nothing," she said quickly. "Just a friend." Mark's eyes narrowed, his expression a mixture of confusion and suspicion. "Since when do your friends text you like that?" Jessica snatched the phone from his hand, her pulse pounding. "It's not what you think, Mark. Trust me." He stared at her for a long moment before shaking his head and walking out of the room. Jessica sank onto the couch, her hands trembling. The walls were closing in, and she wasn't sure how much longer she could keep the truth hidden. As she sat there, her phone buzzed with another message from Ryan. "Everything okay?" Jessica stared at the screen, her heart heavy. She couldn't stop herself from typing back, "I don't know." Jessica knew the lie couldn't hold much longer. The tension in the house was suffocating, Mark's mood shifting from indifferent to suspicious in the days following their confrontation. He wasn't asking direct questions, but his watchful gaze lingered on her more often, and his questions about her comings and goings carried a sharper edge. She should have ended it. Every rational part of her mind told her to cut ties with Ryan and focus on repairing her marriage. But the thought of losing Ryan, his touch, his warmth, the way he made her feel alive, was unbearable. It was a Friday evening when everything unraveled. Mark had gone out with friends after work and Jessica, assuming she had the house to herself, invited Ryan over. She told herself it would be the last time, a chance to say goodbye and end things before it all came crashing down. When Ryan arrived, the sight of him on her doorstep filled Jessica with equal parts longing and dread. "You sure about this?" Ryan asked, his voice low as he stepped inside. Jessica nodded, though her heart felt heavy. I need to see you." They moved to the living room, their conversation stilted, weighted by the knowledge of what was coming. But when Ryan reached for her, Jessica melted into his arms, all her resolve slipping away. The kiss was desperate, their bodies entwining as they clung to each other, oblivious to the ticking clock. The sound of the front door opening snapped Jessica back to reality. "Jess? You home?" Mark's voice froze her in place. She pushed Ryan off her, panic surging through her veins. "Go!" she hissed, shoving him toward the back door. Ryan hesitated, his face tense. "Jess! Now!" she whispered urgently. Ryan slipped out just as Mark entered the living room. He stopped short, his eyes narrowing as he took in the scene. Jessica stood by the couch, her hair mussed, her breathing unsteady. "What's going on?" Mark asked, his voice calm but dangerously low. Nothing, Jessica stammered. I was just cleaning up. Mark's eyes darted to the back door, which was slightly ajar. He crossed the room in 2 strides, yanking it open and stepping outside. Mark, wait, Jessica called, her heart pounding. Mark didn't stop. He walked around the yard, his movements quick and agitated, before coming back inside. You're not going to tell me the truth, are you? He said, his voice trembling with anger. Jessica opened her mouth to respond, but before she could speak, Mark held up a hand. Save it, he said, pulling out his phone. I already know. Jessica's stomach dropped as he scrolled through his screen and held it out to her. On it were screenshots of text messages, her messages to Ryan. How long? Mark demanded, his voice breaking. Jessica couldn't bring herself to meet his eyes. Mark, how long? He shouted, his face contorted with rage. Jessica's shoulders slumped, tears streaming down her face. A few months, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Mark let out a bitter laugh, pacing the room. Unbelievable. My best friend. My wife. How could you? I didn't mean for it to happen, Jessica sobbed. I was lonely, Mark. You've been so distant. And don't you dare put this on me, he snapped, his voice cutting through her like a knife. I've been working my ass off to give us a good life. And this is how you repay me? Jessica crumpled onto the couch, her guilt overwhelming. I'm sorry, she whispered. I never wanted to hurt you. Mark stared at her for a long moment, his jaw clenched. Then he turned and stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind him. Jessica sat in the silence, her chest heaving with sobs. She knew she'd destroyed everything. Her marriage, her friendship, and the life she'd built with Mark. Her phone buzzed on the table, and she glanced at the screen to see Ryan's name. She ignored it, the weight of her choices crashing down on her. There was no going back now. The truth was out, and the fallout had only just begun. The days following the confrontation were a blur of tension and silence. Mark avoided Jessica, spending nights on the couch or disappearing altogether. Jessica's attempts to talk to him were met with cold indifference or bursts of anger, each interaction driving a deeper wedge between them. Ryan had texted her several times, his messages alternating between concern and guilt. Are you okay? We need to talk. Jessica didn't respond. She couldn't. Facing Mark's pain had drained her of any ability to confront Ryan, and the thought of the two of them together now felt suffocating. One evening, Jessica found Mark sitting at the kitchen table, his expression unreadable as he stared at a glass of whiskey in front of him. She hesitated in the doorway, unsure if she should approach. Sit, he said without looking at her. Jessica sat down slowly, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. I've been thinking a lot, Mark began, his voice low and steady. About us. About what happened. Jessica swallowed hard, her heart pounding. Mark, don't, he said sharply, cutting her off. He sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. I'm not interested in hearing another apology. I've heard enough. Jessica nodded, tears stinging her eyes. I loved you, Jess, Mark said, his voice cracking slightly. Hell, I still do. But I can't. I can't look at you without seeing the two of you together. His words hit her like a physical blow. She opened her mouth to respond, but he shook his head. I need you to hear me out, he said. We've been broken for a long time. I know that. But I thought we could fix it. I thought we were strong enough. I thought so too, Jessica whispered, her voice trembling. Mark looked at her then, his eyes filled with a mix of sadness and anger. Did you? Because if you really believed that, you wouldn't have turned to him. My best friend, Jess. How do you even come back from that? Jessica had no answer. She felt the weight of her betrayal pressing down on her, suffocating her. Mark leaned back in his chair, his gaze distant. I've decided to file for divorce, he said finally. Jessica's breath caught, and the room seemed to tilt around her. Mark, please. It's over, Jess, he said firmly. There's nothing left to salvage. I'll be staying with Paul for a while. You can keep the house. I need to move on. Jessica sat there, numb, as Mark stood and left the room. She heard the front door close behind him, and then the silence engulfed her. When Ryan called that night, Jessica finally answered. "Jess," he said, his voice heavy with emotion. "I've been so worried about you. Are you okay?" "No," she said, her voice cracking. "Everything's falling apart, Ryan. Mark's filing for divorce. He's leaving." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "I'm sorry," Ryan said finally. "I never wanted this to happen." Jessica let out a bitter laugh. "Didn't you? You wanted me, Ryan. You said you couldn't stay away." "I wanted you," Ryan admitted, his voice thick with regret. "But not like this. Not at the cost of everything you care about." Jessica closed her eyes, tears streaming down her face. "What do we do now?" Ryan was silent for a moment. "Maybe we take some time, figure out what we really want." Jessica's chest ached at his words. She wanted to argue, to tell him she needed him now more than ever, but deep down, she knew he was right. "I don't know how to do this," she whispered. "Neither do I," Ryan said softly. "But I'm here. Whatever you need, I'm here." Jessica clung to those words, even as doubt gnawed at her. She had already lost so much, her marriage, her sense of stability, and the thought of losing Ryan too was almost too much to bear. But as she lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, she couldn't ignore the truth. The path she had chosen had left her broken and alone, and the pieces of her life felt impossible to put back together. The divorce proceedings were cold and efficient, a stark contrast to the life Jessica and Mark had built together. Papers were signed, assets divided, and just like that, a decade of memories unraveled into legalities and logistics. Jessica stood outside the courthouse on a crisp autumn morning, clutching her coat tightly around her. Mark had walked away without a word after the final hearing, his shoulders hunched as he disappeared into the crowd. She hadn't expected a heartfelt goodbye, but the hollow ache in her chest lingered nonetheless. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. It was Ryan. She hesitated before answering. "Hey," she said softly, her voice barely audible over the hum of traffic. "How are you?" Ryan's voice was gentle, laced with concern. Jessica sighed, leaning against the cold stone wall. "It's done," she said. "Mark's gone. It's all over. Do you want to talk? I can come by," Ryan offered. Jessica closed her eyes, the temptation of his presence pulling at her. "I don't know," she admitted. "I'm not sure what I need right now." There was a pause on the other end before Ryan said, "Take your time, Jess. I'll be here when you're ready." Jessica hung up, slipping her phone back into her pocket. She stared up at the gray sky, her mind a tangle of emotions. In the weeks that followed, Jessica tried to piece together a new normal. The house felt emptier without Mark, the silence echoing in a way that was both freeing and suffocating. She threw herself into work, took long walks in the evenings, and began painting again, a tentative step toward reclaiming parts of herself she'd long neglected. Ryan reached out often, his presence a comfort and a complication. They met for coffee a few times, their conversations filled with a mix of awkwardness and familiarity. But something had shifted between them. The intensity that had once defined their relationship was now tempered by the weight of their shared choices. One evening, as they sat in a quiet corner of a cafe, Ryan finally broached the subject they'd both been avoiding. "Do you think we can make this work?" he asked, his eyes searching hers. Jessica stirred her coffee, avoiding his gaze. "I don't know," she said honestly. "I care about you, Ryan. I do. But everything feels different now." Ryan nodded, his jaw tightening. "I get it. I hate what we did, Jess. Not just to Mark, but to us. It's like we burned everything down before we even had a chance to build something real." Jessica felt a lump rise in her throat. "I don't regret the way you made me feel," she said softly. "But I do regret how it happened. The pain we caused." Ryan reached across the table, his hand covering hers. "I'll always be here for you, no matter what. But if you need space, I'll give you that too." Jessica looked at him, her heart aching with a mix of gratitude and sorrow. Maybe we need to figure out who we are on our own first. Ryan nodded, his expression bittersweet. Maybe we do. The first night in her newly empty home, Jessica sat in her studio, staring at a blank canvas. She thought about Mark, about Ryan, about the woman she had been when this all began. The weight of her choices pressed down on her, but alongside it was a flicker of hope, a chance to rebuild, to start fresh. Picking up a brush, she began to paint, the colors swirling into something new and undefined. It was messy and imperfect, but it was hers. Jessica didn't know what the future held. For her, for Ryan, or for the life she'd left behind. But for the first time in a long time, she felt the stirrings of possibility, a tentative step toward redemption and self-discovery. And as the brush moved across the canvas, she allowed herself to believe that, somehow, she would find her way. Dear listeners, please share your thoughts in the comments, and do not forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel.